Welcome to Equal Dose, the podcast where we examine the social determinants of health and explore effective strategies to enhance health outcomes for everyone. I'm your host, Autria Godfrey in Washington, D.C.
I'm Stephen Horn in London. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the pivotal issues that impact our well-being and discuss how we can collectively work towards increasing health equity across communities. Join us as we bring in experts, share insights, and highlight initiatives making a real difference in creating healthier lives for all.
It is a big day here on today's episode because today we are marking the 70th anniversary of transplantation. First, though, we do want to make this disclaimer. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Now, coming up today, we'll be joined by Kristina Moon from the Billy Moon Foundation to talk all about her husband's amazing legacy through organ donation. Luke Yates from the charity Live Life, Give Life will join us to raise awareness about organ donation after his wife died waiting for a double lung transplant. And Jeff Orlowski, president and CEO of LifeShare Network, discusses transplantation technology and research. The first successful kidney transplant, Stephen, was performed in 1954 by Dr. Joseph E. Murray in Boston, Massachusetts. And this is pretty cool. That transplant was actually between identical twins.
That is cool, isn't it, Audrey? You know, in 1990, Dr. Murray received the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his contribution. According to NHS figures, the technique has saved over 400,000 lives worldwide, and now 3,000 kidney transplants are carried out each and every year in the UK alone. Joining us today in our London studio is Laila Rizvi, who's Director of Strategy and Research at WebsEdge, the company behind the podcast. Laila, what do you think about all these new life-saving procedures that have reached their 70th anniversary today?
I mean, it's pretty crazy because at the time of recording this podcast, there's about 7,728 people waiting for a transplant in the UK alone, according to NHS figures, and about 100,000 people in the US waiting, according to the US Human Resources and Services Administration. They report that you've got about 17 people dying each day from waiting for transplants, and each donor can save up to 8 lives and enhance another 75, which is a profound impact.
You know, it's a really moving discussion, isn't it? Because on the one hand, as you say, you know, you've got all the technology now. We have the means, right, to save lives. Yeah. And a lot of people are dying by waiting for those organs to come through. And it's quite a sobering thing to discuss.
It is our absolute honor now to have with us Billy's wife, Kristina Moon, who has kept his legacy alive these last 2 years by championing the incredible gifts that Billy left behind. Kristina, thank you so much for your time today and for telling Billy's story.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to do this.
Sure. Okay, so let's get started talking about Billy, because his firefighting buddies described him, you know, as a big personality with a huge smile and certainly a passion for the job. But who was the Billy that you knew and loved?
You know, he was my oldest child, is what I would tell people. You know, he was the silly one. He's definitely the silly one. He was a very involved dad. But no matter what, whether it was work or personal, he was very passionate. You know, he was very involved in our children's lives and our family life. You know, he made sure to work his schedule around things and events that we had going on. But at the same time, he had such a dedication to the fire service and being there and helping others. I feel like he instilled that same, you know, those same priorities in our children as well. So, but a big personality. He was 6'4". You couldn't miss him walking into a room.
I love that. So let's go back to December of 2022. You get a phone call, you learn what's happening, what's going on, and then at the end of the day, you have a decision to make. Can you walk us through that day?
So on December 12th, 2022, I received a phone call while I was at work, and they informed me that Billy was injured at work, and they were taking him to a hospital. So I was picked up through the FDNY, and I was rushed to a hospital in Brooklyn. He had fallen about 20 feet preparing for a training exercise inside the quarters of Rescue 2, his firehouse in Brooklyn. He had suffered some severe head trauma, and within that first 12 hours, he had 2 brain surgeries and intensive interventions, and you know, so many things were going on. And he really, over the course of a week, never showed signs of improvement no matter how hard and how much work they were doing in the hospital. And I remember one day I was sitting in this little yellow room with broken chairs, is how I describe it to people. And I'm getting the medical update and we're talking. And I kind of just blurted out to them and said to them, like, he's an organ donor. And I felt like it was really important information for them. And they look at me and they're like, we're good. We're not there yet. You don't need to tell us that. I'm like, no. I'm like, something's telling me, I feel like you need to know. And about a week later, it was evident he wasn't going to survive his injuries. So he did donate his organs and he saved the lives of 5 others. 2 were retired members of the FDNY. 1 actually suffering from 9/11 related lung disease.
And had you given much thought to organ donation before that, Kristina?
Myself personally, not really, but Billy did. We were in our living room one day. I was in the living room and the dining room. It's like 15 feet apart. And he looks at me and he asks me, he's like, are you an organ donor? And I kind of just looked back at him and I was like, I think I would, but it's not, I don't think it's on my license. And he looked at me, he looked down at me because he was so much taller than me. He's like, well, why not? And I changed my license. And he had the same conversation with people at the kitchen table, and he donated his heart, his liver, his lungs, and both of his kidneys. So that legacy, that passion really, it was important to him.
Yeah, it's interesting that it was something that was so passionate to him in life, and now in his death, it's become passionate for you, and you've created the Billy Moon Foundation. What can you tell us about what the foundation does and the mission?
Yeah, I realize it's this important topic that people don't really talk enough about. They all agree it's important, but no one's really talking about it. So we've kind of started the conversation, and I tell people Billy and I had a hard conversation because while it was difficult, I understood and he knew his wishes for when he died. And when I was in the hospital, it just put that much less stress on us as a couple. And I was asked by the fire commissioner at the time to come talk to the current probie class before they graduated. And I went and I talked to them and I explained to them in that room of 300 probationary firefighters in 17 days, they could all die waiting for an organ. And we started going through all of these statistics and talking about things. More people were asking to hear our story and wanting to know what was going on. So it's kind of just created its own domino effect. And I've been all over the country now starting to talk about it. And we're helping donor and recipient families financially when we can. We're looking into creating a family room somewhere. So it's like this really big legacy. And I get to keep talking about him. And he was my best friend, so it helps.
You're keeping him alive, for sure. You mentioned earlier, that Billy's organs have kept 5 people alive. Some of those were retired firefighters, even FDNY firefighters. Do you keep in touch with those recipients? And what has it been like for you and your family? I know you have 2 small children. Does that help?
So I personally know Billy's heart, liver, and lung recipients. And we have friendships with them. We have a little text chain where we keep in touch, ask how people are doing. They're traveling the world. One of them just had their 10th grandchild. And my kids, they say they hope they live to be 100 because that means a piece of dad got to live to be 100 too. And I feel like it's almost a part of organ donation too that people need to talk more about. Those relationships are also really important for the trauma and the situation that you've gone through.
There's a story that I want you to tell about when y'all went to meet the heart recipient, and I believe it was your son could hear the heart beating. Can you share that? It's such an inspiring story.
It was about 11 months after Billy passed away. We had the opportunity to meet his heart recipient. And while we're there, there's press and there's cameras and there's family members and, everyone's all tense and, nervous, excited. And I learned during this time that, to donate a heart, it makes perfect sense to me now, but you need to donate to someone of a similar stature to you. We're there and all of a sudden this man that's the same size as my husband comes walking out of the room. And, you're already crying and emotional and you're hugging this person that's the same size. Rich is 6'3" and Billy was 6'4". And then we get to listen to the heartbeat. And Colin, he listens to it and he had the guts to say what I couldn't. He's like, it was like laying down next to my dad when I would take naps and I could just hear his heartbeat all over again. It's very profound and magical because it's really exactly what it was. And we also took the heartbeat to Build-A-Bear and we put the recording inside Build-A-Bears and we each have a Build-A-Bear at home.
Oh, I love that. I absolutely love that. What an incredible story. When people think of Billy Moon, what do you want them to think?
I want them to remember the passion that he had for life. He's a passion for the fire service, of course, but he just had a passion for life and he was always there for other people. He believed in doing what was right for others. And I think that's the best part about him. As strong a personality was, and he'd convince you across that kitchen table if you were working with him, he would be there if you needed him. Maybe a little late, but he would be there.
Kristina, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been incredibly insightful. And where can we go to learn a little bit more about organ donation and find out more about the Billy Moon Foundation?
So we have billymoonfoundation.org, and we're also on Instagram and Facebook. We hope that people, when they see our stories, they share our stories and follow us, because we feel like that's what's going to keep spreading and helping us, whether it's me going and sharing our story or just help getting more people aware of how important it is.
Absolutely. And the power of storytelling, I think we sometimes underestimate it.
Yeah, it really is. And, social media is, it really is the driving force of a lot of that. It's the way to get the message out there. So we're trying our best to use that as our biggest factor to help.
You're doing an excellent job keeping his memory alive and hopefully providing support to those families that need it as they sit on that, organ donation wait list. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yes, thank you
for
very
your
much,
mission.
Kristina.
I really appreciate it.
Absolutely delighted now to be joined in the London studio here by Dr. Luke Yates, who's a trustee from the UK charity Live Life, Give Life, which is to educate and to encourage organ transplants. Luke, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming to our studio today. It's great to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
Perhaps you could share a little bit of your own personal story with us and your story of you and your wife.
Sure. So in 2013, April, my wife, Samantha, died still in need of an organ transplant. In essence, a suitable organ couldn't be found in time. If I take us back to the kind of wait period, I guess, it started really with Sam. We were just married. She started her new job as a newly qualified teacher, teaching children, 9 and 10-year-olds, which was her dream career. And I went off to start on my PhD program. Sam was born with a genetic disease, cystic fibrosis, which meant that she was very prone to getting sort of infections and things, particularly in the lungs. And a very severe lung infection in that summer of her first year in her dream job wreaked havoc on her lungs. And that severely reduced her lung capacity. And then we managed to get, back home after a protracted period in hospital. It was very intensive treatment. And we tried to go back to a sense of normalcy. And a few hospitalizations later and a few more infections, Sam had to medically retire from her career she'd worked very hard to get. And we were waitlisted for a double lung transplant. And we waited a very long time. More than 3 years we waited in vain. The entire period of time I tried to continue my graduate studies and to give you a sense of the time period that elapsed whilst waiting, I managed to finish my PhD. And, I like to kind of talk about the wait and just the impact that it had on our lives. And I often, describe, sort of waiting for transplant as not a passive experience. Right. It's a very active one. You're trying to live with organ failure. And that is really, obviously has incredible amount of challenges. We had lists of treatments just to stay alive long enough to try and get that transplant. We were really playing a waiting game very actively. And unfortunately, because of a chronic shortage of donors in the UK, we weren't successful in getting a transplant. And that's obviously when Sam died.
I mean, I'm sure there's 100 answers to this, but what do you put the chronic shortage down to?
No, that's a very good question. I think the shortage really comes down to a severe lack of people, signing up to be potential organ donors. Right. It's really a societal issue, I think, in that sense. And the more donors we have, then or people who have committed to be donors, potential donors, then the greater the likelihood of getting that transplant that people desperately need.
What made you decide to become a trustee for the charity?
Well, I think all of that started in sort of towards the end of Sam's life. She was very active in campaigning for more organ donors, and she really wanted people who were waiting not to wait as long as she did. And so very valiantly, she used her precious breath to go on radio interviews and TV interviews just to explain just her situation and how it could be different if more people signed up.
Right.
And as a direct consequence, I wanted to continue her legacy. So I joined Live Life, Give Life, which is the only pan-organ charity in the UK to raise awareness. In doing so, I want to keep her legacy alive by continually campaigning for more donors, ultimately.
Now, look, you're a scientist.
Yes.
You're a research scientist.
Yeah.
So what impact does that, training and that knowledge and that education have on this work in encouraging people to become donors?
I don't think there's a direct relationship, in a sense that maybe I can, talk the same language as a lot of clinicians and a lot of transplant surgeons that I talk to on a regular basis, and I sometimes go to transplant conferences and present, our work and our campaigning. But I guess it was, I guess our work as a charity is really involved in sort of educating young people in terms of how amazing their organs are, how to look after them, and that you can donate them, which is a wonderful and heroic thing to do. And I think that just that interest in medicine in general, I think where some of my training sort of helps.
And what do you think some of the challenges are in today in raising awareness about that ability to donate your organs?
It's multifactorial in this country. There's a lot of misnomers and misinformation around organ donation.
Right.
And I think in the UK, we don't like talking about it because we don't like talking about death.
Right.
And I think that's a challenge from a sort of superstitious nation. We think we're going to bring about it much faster if we openly talk about it. But the research is very clear. 90% of families who donate their loved ones' organs knew their loved ones' wishes.
Right.
So it needs a conversation around the decisions that you've made around donation first, which is a barrier to most families.
Luke, it's such a pleasure to meet you and have you, with us today and sharing your story. I'd be interested to hear kind of your thoughts on what are some of the impacts that this increased awareness and this increased education on organ donation could have on individuals like you and your wife, those that are waiting for these transplants.
The entire time we were waiting for a transplant, it was a long time, but we never gave up hope because there were many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have signed up as a commitment to be organ donors. I think it was an element of trying to live as long as possible, I guess, and manage the challenges that came with lung failure, just to get that transplant. I think, and raising awareness ultimately increases the number of donors or registered donors, which ultimately increases the number of transplants that happen every year.
Not to pivot just a tiny bit, but as someone who is not familiar with the transplant process or, being on a waiting list, I just wonder, what is that like as you're sitting on that waiting list? What are doctors telling you that keep you sustaining that hope that you were just talking about? And do you work your way up that waiting list based on the severity of your condition?
Oh, that's a good question. Here in the UK, in terms of priorities, it's prioritized based on how much in need you are. And so the longer you wait and the more in need you are, the further you rise up that list. And there are some challenges with that. I think given that we have a national health service here in this country, often it's not distributed geographically very fairly, I think. And so it's a real balancing act of being able to manage transplantation need and then where donation occurs aren't necessarily in the same geographical place. And in terms of, waiting and what it's like, it's emotionally and physically painful. That's we had oxygen, a machine concentrator in our home, filtering oxygen out of the air to deliver it across tubes that were scattered across the house to deliver oxygen to Sam. We had liquid oxygen in a shed in the garden that we'd fill up a small portable oxygen carrier from to allow us to go out. We needed a wheelchair just to go to the supermarket. There are all these different aspects and disabilities around waiting. So it's an extremely active process. And all the time you're thinking, and on tenterhooks, is today going to be the day we get that call?
Right.
Are they going to find a suitable match? And we did have a couple of what we call false alarms, where we get called in the middle of the night and we're racing to the hospital, and then only to be turned away later when the donor organs weren't deemed sort of suitable, if you like. And so there's an emotional roller coaster of that.
And Luke, building upon that, in terms of priority, needs, waiting, organ donation and organ transplantation is obviously littered with so many ethical dilemmas. So how should we navigate those ethical dilemmas, and particularly when it comes to organ consent and access? Like you mentioned, it's not geographically distributed equally. And what barriers do we kind of need to overcome and address when it comes to those ethical considerations?
Yes, so there's a geographical issue with prioritization. And so we have in the UK a super urgent list, and that for heart and lung transplants, and that's a very recent thing, where those who have only sort of weeks or just a few days, left are really bumped up the list, and there's a real drive to find a donor. But that's chiefly because heart and lungs, they have to be transplanted once donated within a really short time window.
Right.
About 1 hour or so is the time frame you need. So where donation occurs, if a family donates, then the recipient has to be relatively close, because the organs generally don't survive outside of the body for very long. To give it some sort of equality and parity in that sense, given the best matched, the most in need are put together, if you like, that requires a lot of technological innovation as a means to transport organs around safely. And there are some technologies out there which are helping to alleviate some of this bottleneck. And I guess on a societal level, in the UK, we've moved to a deemed consent law. We've actually changed the law on organ donation, where if you can sign the organ donor register of your intent to be a donor, or you can say you don't want to be a donor, and if you've done neither, health professionals will consider a presumed consent that you're quite likely to want to be a donor if you've not made a decision. However, that's a soft opt-out, meaning they'll have to ask your family for permission.
Right.
And often, in the UK in particular, the families say no, and we have one of the highest refusal rates in Europe. And the law change, which has been in effect for about 5 years, hasn't seen a tremendous increase in consent rates. Actually, quite the opposite. It's gone down by about 5% over the last several years.
And is there any reason for that high kind of denial rate when it comes to consent? Is there something specific about the UK? Is it our culture?
That's a great question, and I don't think we have an answer for that. There are a number of modifiable factors, if you like. Sure. Religion is often cited as a barrier, but all major religions permit organ donation. And so I think there's an element of, I guess, superstition around it, potentially. But it's a really difficult thing to unpick.
Sure.
Well, Luke, thanks ever so much for coming and talking to us today. We really appreciate it, so thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Great to have you. Thanks, Luke.
Jeff Orlowski, president and CEO of LifeShare Network, discusses transplantation technology and research.
So Jeff, could you just kick off? Could you give us an update maybe on the latest advances in organ transplantation and particularly with relating to perfusion technology?
About the time that we started to see an increasing volume of donation after circulatory death donors and an aging population, both of which are impacting the organ and thus impacting what's the ideal way for that organ to be perfused. So I would say the biggest process has been moving towards normothermic preservation and away from hypothermic static storage.
Great. I just have a quick question, I guess, about normothermic perfusion in a sense of practically how does that help transplant surgeons during the transplantation process? maybe explain a little bit what the difference is between this static cold storage preservation method and this sort of newer normothermic perfusion method, and why clinically that's really important?
In the normothermic space, what now is happening is we're keeping the organ at more or less normal body temperature, and that allows for the organ to actually be evaluated beyond just flow and resistance. And up until now, with hypothermic preservation, we had very little knowledge once the organ was recovered and put into storage until it was reperfused.
Interesting. So, given the challenges in organ donation from underrepresented communities, what strategies has LifeShare Network implemented to increase awareness and hopefully participation in these areas?
Well, our efforts have been targeted at our demographic. So we've been looking within the state of Oklahoma at what are the populations within our demographic that we want to reach out to. And a prominent one for us is the Native American population. And we have worked through a number of projects to raise awareness in the Native American community, and also to work with Native American tribal leadership to increase the presence of donation as part of the community's education. So, for example, we have done targeted videos with Native American families who have benefited from donation, as well as Native American families who participated in the donor process, to talk from the cultural perspective of individual tribes within the state of Oklahoma about how donation helped them through the loss of their loved one, or how the benefit of donation for their loved one who needed a transplant was manifested. Similar to that, we are now working, and have been for the last last 2 years really, to work towards better awareness and better contact with the Hispanic population, which is a faster growing population within the state of Oklahoma. And then lastly, we are working with the African American population, the Black population.
And have you had any success stories or any, great outcomes since you've launched these initiatives specifically targeting those underrepresented groups?
Yes, we actually just this past summer presented some data at a national forum where we looked at the rates of registration, the rates of referral, and the rates of authorization. And within the African American and Native American population, the rates of referral and the authorization rates are essentially identical to our white population.
Can you kind of elaborate on the role that partnerships with local hospitals or healthcare providers or other organizations play in the success of your programs, especially when it comes to research and community outreach?
Yes, I think it's essential that we have good partnerships with our hospitals in our community, and also with community groups. Certainly when we're working in the underserved populations around the state, but specifically with donor hospitals and hospitals in our community, it is very important to have good working relationships there. And the reason for that is to provide a continuum of care to the donor and to the donor family, so that this is a reasonable experience at the time, and so that the long-lasting memory and impact of the donation process is one that's positive for the donor family. At the end of the day, the whole process begins with the donor, and it is really important to never lose sight of the fact that this is a human gift from a dying individual to a person who will die without that gift. And so keeping that humanity in the process and making sure that the needs of the donor family are supported and that the needs of the hospital staff are supported, because, again, remember, people go into healthcare to save lives, and when you have a donation, it means that that patient's life has been lost. And so that's an emotional experience for those healthcare workers who have bonded with the family, who have been nurturing that family through the process, who hope to save that patient's life. And it's very important for us as an organization to work well with them so that the experience is positive. The other reason it's very important is that donation is a very complicated process. If a person is donating 4 organs for transplant, let's say heart, liver, kidneys, there are a lot of tests to be done. There are a lot of evaluations to be done. There's a lot of communication that has to occur. The logistics of arranging a surgical recovery with a heart team that may be coming from 1,000 miles away, simultaneously arranging for our local surgeon to recover the liver so that we can send it to someone, and identifying out of the 100,000 people that are on the waiting list for a kidney who are the best matches for those kidneys and getting that organ offered to their transplant center is a logistical undertaking. And if we're not working well with the hospital, it's very hard for that process to go well.
Jeff, thanks ever so much indeed for coming in and talking to us today. We hugely appreciate it, and thank you again. Now, Laila, what's coming up in the next episode?
So coming up next, we'll be looking at equity in data and health research, which should be an exciting episode.
I'm looking forward to it already.
Very much looking forward to that. Thank you to everyone. And don't forget to share, like, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, goodbye.
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 Equal Dose is brought to you by WebsEdge.